So for RNNs, what have we got? We have got, all right, so we've got our RNN. And we are feeding in some x sub i's at time I. So we've got a sequence of data. Let's look at the simplest example. Let's look at, let's say, we're doing Yelp reviews to polarity, so positive or negative. Okay, so we are going to, we have this RNN, and I'm going to actually show it kind of unrolled. It really works as a for loop, but I'm going to unroll this and say that we feed in, to begin with, x sub 1 into this RNN, and we get out, as we always get out, y hat sub 1, and then we keep going, we feed in x sub I, we get out y hat sub I, we keep going, and eventually we get to our last element, let's say x sub k, and we get out y hat sub k. So for our Yelp reviews, what format are these x sub i's going to be in? Yeah, the question is, if what we're doing is Yelp reviews to polarity, what is the format of each of these x sub i's in the sequence?
Oh, like for the polarity sequence, I guess would be numbers that represent the polarity.
Well, so let's think about this a second. These are the x's, right? These are the inputs. So we have an input like this place sucks. Okay? What's x sub 1 going to be? I'll tell you that k is going to be 3 because we're going to feed in 3 words.
Yeah, okay, so, or if we're starting indexing at 0, would x sub 1 be this?
I'm assuming we're doing mathematical instead of computer science notation, so 1 is the first one. So it's this, and then how do we actually represent this? Because we can't feed in the characters.
Yeah, it's some index in a dictionary.
Yeah, index in the dictionary. So these are all indexes in the dictionary. So that's what our x's are coming in. We go through, we feed in x sub 1, which is this, x sub 2 place, x sub k. We have actually 4 of them. This place sucks bad. All right, and finally we get bad. And then where do we look for our polarity?
Why?
Well, oh, sorry. How do we know what the predicted polarity is? So I'm going to say
probability of the word given like the previous word.
No, so this is really just this is a prediction problem, right? We're trying to predict, is this a good review or a bad review, right? This is in fact exactly the part 1 from lab 4, right? So we get this review, we have a y of 0, which says it's bad. And now in this diagram here, where are you going to be reading out what it thinks the polarity should be?
Now last y prediction.
The last y hat, exactly. We would look at the last y hat and compare this last y hat against 0, compute our loss, backpropagate. We'll talk about backpropagation next week. Do we care about these intermediate y hats? Do we care about what the y hat was when we put in this? No, we don't care with this. We just care, the end of the review, was it positive or negative? Okay. We have to have a history. We have to have some form of history in this RNN because, well, the last word was bad, so I guess that's kind of an indication that it's not a good review. Let's say it's not this sucks. It wasn't bad, it was totally. Okay? So if we just looked at the word totally, that wouldn't be enough to tell us what the polarity is. We have to actually know what previous words were to tell what the final polarity of this is. Yes? Now let's come up with another example where we do need to use the y-hats. Shusen, can you come up with an example where we would need intermediate y-hats as well as the final one? Oh, I'm going to give you an even simpler one. That could work, and we can figure out where's positive and where's negative within here. Let's instead make a parts of speech recognizer. Okay, so this, can you see that in? So sucks is, let's see, a verb, totally is an adverb, And this is some part of speech that I don't actually know right now. Is this an adjective? Let's say it's an adjective, okay? Because it does modify place, I guess. So let's say we've got one of these. We are trying to identify parts of speech. So in that case, when we feed in an X, out would come a prediction for what part of speech it would be, right? So this, the output, the prediction for part of speech. Place, the output part of speech, and so on. Do we need recurrence? Could we do this just with a simple neural network that just takes a word without any surrounding context?
Yes.
Okay, let me give you this sentence. He ate the orange. Let me just say, he ate the juicy orange versus he drew with orange crayon. In this case, orange is a noun, and in this case, orange is an adjective, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you can't just look at the word, you do need some context. And so that's why we would want this context in here and have a recurrent neural network rather than just a simple network that took word. Does that make sense? Look at another case where we're doing prediction. Let's say we are predicting stock prices from previous stock prices. Okay, so our X here is going to be 1, 7, 3, 5. This is our X, and our Y is then 2. Okay, so if you see the stock price go 1735, you'd expect the next one to be 2. Okay. So we could do this with a sequence where you fit in 1, 7, 3, 5, 2, and just look, 1, 7, 3, 5, and look at Y hat sub 4 and see that it's 2. That'd work, right? But what we could do, basically we've only learned one Y hat in that case. What we could do is instead organize it such that X is 1735 and Y is 7, 3, 5, 2. That is, if we feed in a 1, we expect the next value should be a 7. If we feed in a 7, the next value should be a 3. We feed in then a 3, so we've seen the sequence 1, 7, 3, we should get out a 5. And if we've seen the sequence 1, 7, 3, 5, we should get out a 2. So see how we're actually kind of doing 4 predictions here instead of just 1? And so we can compare Y hat sub 1 against 7, Y hat sub 2 against 3, Y hat sub 3 against 5, and Y hat sub 4 against 2, rather than just looking at the final output. That's basically how language models work. In fact, is that they will predict after the first word, what's the second word? After the first 2 words, what's the third word? After the first 3 words, what's the fourth word? And so on. Because it would be wasteful feeding an entire X and only getting out one Y hat. So they feed it in X and get out a bunch of Y hats. What we're going to look at now is how does this thing actually work?
So it seems like RNNs can solve many-to-one problems and one-to-one problems, but can you solve one-to-many problems?
Yeah, so let's see. We did many-to-one. One-to-one doesn't make sense for a recurrent neural network because we have that recurrence, and so we want some looping. Can you do one-to-many? Yes, you can. An example would be for, let's see, take an image and generate a caption from the image. So your input would be, let's say, an image. You'd probably run it through a little convolution to try and understand it and feed out the last layer of the convolution. And that would be our single input. And then it would start feeding out probabilities of words. Okay. When we do generation of words like that, you actually have to take into account the word that's chosen as your input to the next recurrence.
Use the previous output as the input to the next RNNs.
You don't use the previous output because this would be a probability distribution of what the words might be. You choose a word after you get this probability distribution, and then that word gets fed in next.
Okay, so not the activations, but you translate it to like a word and then, okay.
You translate it to an actual word. Yep. We will talk more about that, and that's actually going to be what Lab 6 is going to be about, is doing generation from a language model. So you're going to build a language model and train it from scratch on Shakespeare in one case and on the Linux source code in another case. And then you are going to try and use an RNN as a generator of Shakespearean-like text. And you'll basically do that idea of it'll give you a probability distribution, you'll choose one, you'll tell it what word was chosen, and you go on from there. I am getting ahead of myself, though. So how do we have this memory? All right? The way the memory works is we actually, in our RNN, have an additional output, which I'm going to call H sub I, which stands for hidden state. And we have an extra input, H sub I minus 1. So the RNN actually takes in 2 inputs and spits out 2 outputs. And then the output, H sub I, gets fed in as the input to the I plus first iteration, and so on, until finally we get to here, H sub k minus 1 goes into here, and spits out H sub k, which usually we don't care about. How do we start this process? Nicholas, like what comes in here? Do we have any memory that we care about when we're starting a sequence?
I think not when we're starting it, but we do want
So we can remember sort of our memory in here. We don't have any incoming memory, so this is H sub 0. What might we initialize this to? So this H sub 0, H sub I minus 1, is some vector, right? It's just like activations coming out of CNN from one layer to the next layer. This is a vector of numbers. So we have to feed in a vector of numbers. And by convention, we just use zeros. Okay? So we feed in zeros here, and then after the first word, it's going to feed in some vector of the same size with different values, different values, different values, different values, and so on. So when we get to our Yelp review that says, this place sucks totally, we have totally coming in here, and we have some vector here that's somehow going to represent they don't like it because it said sucks. 2 inputs, 2 outputs. This thing is actually very simple. We have 3 weight matrices. WXH, WHH, and WHY. All right? And these matrices are going to be applied to the incoming X, I guess really if I'm going to write this right, WHH is over here. Okay. And so here's going to be our formula for H sub I. We're going to say H sub I equals, we're going to take X and we're going to multiply it by this WXH matrix. We call it WXH because in some sense we're turning an X into an H. So that takes care of this input. H sub I is going to be dependent on X sub I. We also need to incorporate H sub I minus 1. So we're going to add in H sub I minus 1, and we're going to multiply that by the WHH matrix. And then finally, we're going to add a bias. So this is almost the simplest thing we could possibly do to do some linear transformation of X, of H, and combine them together. Ria, what do we all normally do after we apply a linear transformation in a neural network?
We have like a ReLU.
Yeah, we're going to have some activation function, G sub h, applied to this. And normally it's ReLU for this one. So this is how we are going to be computing this hidden vector, this hidden state information. We're going to be taking the current x, which should really be x sub I, and applying it to the weight matrix. We're going to take the previous h and apply it to a different matrix, and we're going to add a bias, and then we're going to do some sort of an activation function. So Neil, if we were to look at y hat sub I, how might we compute y hat sub I simply?
So we have x sub I and h sub I, so it's probably some multiplication of those.
Do we already have some multiplication of x sub I and h sub I minus 1?
Sure, yeah. And that's on
Yeah.
all right.
We already have h sub I.
Yeah.
So let's say we've already combined them in some way that's suitable. How might we compute our y hat?
I mean, some fully connected layers sounds sufficient, but not really sure.
What if I told you we have an unused weight matrix called WHY? Okay, and what would we do with that?
You would do x sub I times WHY, or sorry, yeah, times, I guess you would just take in the history. So I guess you could do h sub I times WHY.
H sub I times WHY, I'm liking this so far, plus a bias, let's say that's specific to y, and apply a nonlinearity, G sub y. This G sub y might be a ReLU. If we were trying to predict house prices, what would be a good G sub y?
I mean, it's not sigmoid, so it's probably ReLU.
Yeah, we want non-negative, right? Or, yeah, non-negative. So if we were trying to predict house prices, this might be a ReLU. What if we're trying to predict difference in house prices from year to year?
In like percentage or like in absolute value?
Absolute value.
Probably ReLU again.
So you are young enough that it looks like house prices never go down, right? But actually they do. So if we have to take into account that house prices can either go up over a year or down from one year to the next, what would be better than ReLU?
Probably just identity.
Yeah, identity would be good. What if we're trying to do probabilities?
Sigmoid.
Yeah, sigmoid. If we were trying to do a probability distribution, like for what word this is, what might we use?
Softmax.
Yeah, standard stuff, okay? There's nothing special, the fact that we're an RNN. So this is all there really is to RNNs. This plus a for loop, where we actually apply this repetitively. Notice the matrices here are going to be the same matrix that we applied x1 to x2 to x3 to x4 all the way to x sub k. We do the same operation. Notice also that h sub I depends on x sub I, right? And it also depends on h sub I minus 1. What's h sub I minus 1 depend on? X sub I minus 1 and h sub I minus 2. And this goes all the way down until we get to x sub 1. So h sub I depends on x1, x2, x3, all the way up to x sub I. That's the idea of the history, really. The history, the memory, is just the fact that we have a formula that depends on all of the x's. So we can take into account all the x's. We have to hope now it'll train right to do that. Questions at this point?
The W, that's like individual to each piece of the RNN, right?
Each piece like this and this and this? No. It's a single RNN with we only have 3 matrices total and 2 biases total. And we're going to just repeatedly apply these formulae with the same weight matrices and the same biases for different x sub i's and different h sub I minus 1s. That it kind of makes sense in the sense that, you know, in a CNN, we want to be translation invariant, right? We don't care where we're finding a I at the top left or at the bottom right, or a wheel or something. And similarly here, we don't care where we find the word sucks, but just the fact that we find a word somewhere means it should be included in subsequent memory. Okay. If we had different matrices for each one, it'd have to learn kind of independently, oh, what if it gets sucks as the first word? What if it gets sucks as the second word, and so on? And here it doesn't matter where it gets it. As always, of course, what it's learning is up to the neural network. We don't choose it. It depends on the data, how we're training it, what is actually being stored in here. You know, whether there is a flag in here that says, oh yes, they got the word sucks, you know, or they got a negative word, for example. We're going to talk about backpropagation and how you do the training for RNNs. Okay, it's something called backpropagation through time. The basic idea is we just do the same backpropagation we normally do. If we have a long sequence and we have a loss for, let's say, y hat sub k, if we look at, let's say, one of these matrices, there's a path to these matrices through all the h sub i's, right? H sub I plus 1, h sub I plus 2, all the way to h sub k minus 1, to the y hat, to the loss. As we're backpropagating, we're going to have to be multiplying by the derivative of this function, and we're going to have to be multiplying by basically WHH. So if WHH has very small values, what's going to happen is we go through and multiply over and over and over and over again.
It'll approach 0.
Yeah, it'll approach 0. So we'll get a vanishing gradient at least for that path. And what if it's really big?
Then it'll explode.
Exactly. So that's a problem. It's hard to correct very early items in the sequence through this very long path. We're going to see an approach to deal with that. And sort of on the same, another side of the same coin, it's very hard to keep memories of things for long periods of time. Right? If you're trying to maintain a memory of something from very early in a sequence to way in the future, it's hard to do that with these h sub i's. So foreshadowing, we're going to see something called an LSTM, long short-term memory, which provides, as well as h, an actual memory cell or set of memory cells, which are specifically designed to just automatically maintain their value. And then there are mechanisms to read data out of it and mechanisms to clear it or to write to it. That will allow us to maintain memory for long periods of time and also allow us something kind of like a skip connection in ResNet. So a connection that'll have a 1 derivative so that we can push gradient back. That's forthcoming. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how exactly the backpropagation works Wednesday or next week.
Has anyone explored using like different weight matrices for different parts of the input?
I don't know. How would you decide which ones to use when?
Maybe some aspect of the data.
Yeah, I guess it could learn to do it. That's sort of related to attention, which is what we're going to talk about as we talk about transformers. So attention is this idea of there might be some way of learning, let's say as I'm in this portion of, I've seen this history of data, and I decide I'd really like to look back at some word in the past. And so a mechanism where you can focus your attention on a particular area in the past. And there's a learning mechanism where the attention can kind of learn where to look and what to get from it. So that's this attention mechanism is something that originally was added to RNNs, kind of for the idea you're thinking of, I think, so that you could specifically look back at earlier inputs. Eventually, that was turned into a transformer model where there's no RNN at all. It's just all attention. So at any point in time, you're kind of looking and seeing, what do I want to look back at in the past? You know, where do I want to look? What do I want to get from it? And maybe multiple forms of attention. We'll see that in the future too. One thought you may have is, this is a pretty simple model. And yes, we're applying it multiple times, but we're applying the same weight matrices, the same biases, the same nonlinearities. Is this really all that powerful? And there's definitely a limit to what you can learn here. So let's look first at what you can control over this RNN. When you're specifying an RNN, what is it you're actually specifying about it? Are you explicitly specifying the length of what you're putting in?
No.
No, the length depends on your input. You're going to just look at the input and see what it is. What about the size of the input? Rafi, you could take this one as well. So are you controlling the size of the input? Who controls it?
I guess just like the characteristics of the input itself.
Yeah, so it's a characteristics of the input, presumably. But you do have to tell the RNN how big it's going to be, because it needs to know how big a matrix to make. Okay? It can't just wait until it looks at the data to see, because when you instantiate the RNN, it has to know how big it is. So you have to know, or you specify what I'll call the size of X, right? Yuki, what else do you specify about this RNN?
I guess, do you also get to specify like how big you want your memory be, like H?
Yeah, that's basically the size of H, right? So you could have, the smallest would be you'd have one number coming through, and that's your memory. Everything's stored in one number. You might instead have 1,000 numbers. All right? So this really controls the power of the RNN. What else do you specify, Shintang? Does the RNN know enough?
Maybe you can specify like the size of your weight matrices.
Okay, so if you specify the size of X and the size of H, that determines the size of this weight matrix, right? Because the size of X tells you how many rows there are, and the size of H tells how many columns there are. If you specify the size of H, that tells you how big this matrix is. What about this matrix? The WHY.
So like you want it to be the right size to produce the right kind of output you want?
Exactly. So you're going to need to know sort of the size of Y, where by size I mean how big, how many outputs are there at any particular time step. So how many inputs there are at a particular time step, how many outputs there are at a particular time step, and how big the hidden size is at any particular time step. Cynthia, what else do we have to specify?
The activation function.
Right, so you're going to need to specify G sub Y and G sub H. Once you've done that, you're done. Okay, that specifies everything about the RNN. So if you want a more powerful RNN, make H bigger. Okay, if you make H huge, you may be overfitting. So what do you do, Cynthia, at that point, if you're overfitting?
You could use regularization technique.
Yeah, you'd use regularization. Data augmentation, you can actually add dropout into an RNN. You could do label smoothing. You could do lots of different stuff you could probably add batch norm, I believe. So all those things. And if it still didn't work, you're still overfitting, you could reduce H. However, what we're looking at here is really sort of like one layer of a CNN. I mean, we are applying multiple times because of the sequence, but we're applying the same one. Wouldn't it be neat if we could have kind of different hidden values that represented more and more abstract things? And so we are going to learn next week that you can actually set up RNNs in layers so that the output here, the y-hats, are really just inputs to another RNN. And then those are inputs to another RNN, and eventually you have your final y-hats coming out. So you can think of it kind of like this whole thing is one layer in a regular neural net, and then we can stack on top of that. We'll see that next week too. So that's what we're going to talk about RNNs today. On Wednesday, we are going to be implementing RNNs. So you're actually going to take the formulae and go ahead and write a module in PyTorch that does RNNs. All right. The lab 6, the final lab, is where you're going to be doing generation. So you're going to actually be training an RNN from scratch on Shakespeare, on Linux source code, and then using those language models that you've created to actually generate fake Shakespeare and fake Linux source code. Any questions on this? Because otherwise I'll go on to a financial topic.
I was wondering what's keeping us from adding more layers inside the RNN.
Inside the RNN, nothing in particular. It just turns out that it's handy to have passed on memory from each layer. And so the way to do that is have a single layer here that feeds in output to here, and then go ahead and have another RNN layer above that that gets this as input and then can feed out hidden output. So the problem with having multiple layers within the little RNN here is that we would lose any intermediate memory, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Talking about batch size?
It's not the batch size. We always are going to have a batch size orthogonal to all this. It's talking about how many inputs there are. So for example, let's say you've got you're reading sensors that are reading pollutants. Okay, so you might read carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and 2 others. So you got 5 sensors at every time step. Those 5 sensors would probably be your input to your model. Okay, so there'd be the input to the RNN, each of those 5 different sensor readings. And I'm not sure what we'd be predicting, but we could be predicting something. But so that would be the input, 5. We might be working on multiple batches at a time. So we might be dealing with a batch of 10, and at every time step, we have 5 inputs. Does that explain that?
Yeah, thank you.
Another question. I'm sorry, because I'm pretty sure you answered this exactly 20 minutes ago, but like, just to clarify, for like each block in the RNN, are we using this, like we're using the same 3 matrices? Or no?
Same exact 3 matrices, yep.
Okay, so when we train, when we back propagate through there, is that kind of tricky and weird since there's like multiple?
It would seem like it's tricky and weird. It would seem like, boy, that's really odd because you've got the same weight matrix at multiple time steps in here that we're feeding back. And there's a special name for it, back propagation through time. And I'm just telling you, as soon as you see it, it's not weird. So basically, you'll look for every weight matrix at all the paths to it, no matter what time step it's at. So there might be a path here at time step 1, and a path here at time step 5, and a path here at time step 8. And you'll just add up all the gradients and update the weight matrix. But yeah, we will talk about it in more depth because it's non-obvious.